Hello again, Peter Saturday from Universal Dork here today to talk about a pretty cool horror anthology from 1993 that a lot of people have seemed to kind of overlook throughout the years. And I just gave this one a rewatch, and I think it is most definitely deserving of a lot more praise from horror fans. And that is this little gem here, trapped on VHS, NECRONOMICON, Book of the Dead from 1993. Yes. I just watched this very recently with a group of people for a Halloween movie night that I had at the shop, and I figured it would be the perfect time to revisit this little gem. Trapped on VHS, I went and sort of combed the internet to see what was out there as far as DVD official releases for this film, and I did find a couple websites that appear to have like bootleg versions. So I am very confused why this film has not gotten A, more attention, and B, a brand new fancy ass Blu-ray release, which it needs so badly. It's got some amazingly grotesque special effects that every gore and horror hound would just eat up. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to bring it on here today, to kind of hype this shit up in hopes that someone, crossing my fingers, will step up to the plate, give this thing a restoration. And when I talk about horror anthologies, I know that the first thing that I think of, and probably most people in general think of, are the 1980s, where we got some really great ones. I feel like the 80s was really the prime and most popular time for horror anthologies to exist. You got some really great stuff in there, like Creepshow 1 and 2, absolute classics, of course. You've got the controversial Twilight Zone, the movie, which I love. It does have some pretty crazy controversy involving the very first tale that's told on that one. Now, if you haven't heard about that, I highly suggest looking into what happened during the filming. The first tale on there, which involves a story about racism and a guy that gets kind of sucked into Nazi Germany. But there's some pretty gnarly stuff that happened during the filming of that kind of, well, it sort of darkens the experience of watching that film in general. But then we also have cool stuff in the 80s, lesser known horror anthologies like Dead Time Stories, stuff like that, Night Train to Terror. If I really sat down and thought about it, I could probably give you a whole giant list of really awesome and pretty classic horror anthologies from the 80s. So then the 90s comes around. There were a few from that time period that I think do deserve to be mentioned. Of course, the Tales from the Dark Side, the movie from 1990, which honestly, anything from 1990 that was released was probably filmed in the 80s. So I really don't consider that one a prime example of a 90s horror anthology. Like Tales from the Hood, which is one of my favorite horror anthologies. If you've never seen that one definitely deserves a revisit too, and I think that I really want to snatch that one up on Blu-ray, but I need to give that a rewatch too, because that one is just fantastic. You also had stuff like Trilogy of Terror 2 that came out, which is actually pretty solid as well from the 90s, and then you also had Body Bags, which is one, I don't recall that one being really all that great. It was definitely worth a watch. I think that one's got Mark Hamill in it, and maybe it's got some Wes Craven or John Carpenter, I'm not really sure. I think that Necronomicon here is probably the best one of the 90s. I mean, it's probably in a pretty dead heat tie with Tales from the Hood. This 1993 gem here is just jam-packed with classic, traditional Gothic terror. 3 stories in particular that are loosely based on HP Lovecraft, and 1 wraparound segment, which is Lovecraft themed, but not based on one of his stories. And when I say based on these stories, I really mean that it's very loosely based on the Lovecraft stuff, because we all know that HP Lovecraft's writings and his stories are actually pretty difficult to adapt to the big screen. There hasn't been a lot of films that have done it really very successfully, in my opinion. When you compare the source material to what is actually delivered on the screen, they're usually completely different. Stuff like Reanimator, very different from its source material. Lots of horror inspired by Lovecraft. In the Mouth of Madness from the 90s. Just lots of great stuff in general. This film is very similar to that, and it is brought to you by Brian Yuzna, who is a co-collaborator, kind of partner in crime to Stuart Gordon, who has always been very well known for having that attachment to a lot of the HP Lovecraft material that he's brought to the big screen, or small screen, or VHS. But in this case, Brian Yuzna, who you might know from Bride of Reanimator, he's done a ton of films. He did some of the Silent Night, Deadly Night stuff, the sequels, which I highly recommend as well. Those are really great. But most important, he's most well known for a movie called Society, which is an absolute classic. Super grotesque, bizarre storyline, gory and gooey practical effects in that film. So apparently Yuzna wanted to get this movie together where he could get directors from other countries involved to kind of bring up the marketing value in hopes that it would develop some sort of buzz in a couple other countries. So he had a European director as well and a Japanese director, which he thought would be perfect for the success of Necronomicon Book of the Dead. Every story and installment here, even the wraparound, is totally solid. And that, honestly, is a pretty rare case in the scheme of horror anthologies, because usually the horror anthologies that I've seen, and even some of the most beloved ones, usually have just one that everyone's always waiting for. It's usually the final segment. However, not the case with Necronomicon here. This one is solid all the way through. The effects are absolutely fantastic. The acting's great. And of course, Yuzna involved here. We also have a very familiar face guiding us along this utterly bizarre adventure in the way of Jeffrey Combs. Yep, Jeffrey Combs actually stars in the wraparound segment in the role of, you guessed it, HP Lovecraft himself. So when you first see Jeffrey Combs kind of come onto the scene here, you might not even recognize him because he's got some prosthetics on to make him look just like HP Lovecraft, or also just like Bruce Campbell with his giant chin. So yeah, he kind of looks like Bruce Campbell in here, which is actually pretty cool. But this film alone, having Jeffrey Combs as our guide here to all of the stories that unfold, is one of the absolute best parts of this film, in my opinion, because I'm a huge Jeffrey Combs fan, and he is a national treasure to all of horror itself, in my opinion. Yuzna is not alone here. He, like I said, he also gets one from Europe named Christoph Gans, who does the segment here called The Drowned. He also did a couple other films that are worth mentioning. A 2001 horror kind of action film called Brotherhood of the Wolf. I'm not sure if you remember that, but man, that film was going all around the horror circuit back in the early 2000s, and I remember that being a pretty big deal. It's actually a pretty cool movie. It's just got some really bad CGI werewolf stuff in it that, had they just avoided that, I think it would have been an absolute classic. But, you know, I might have to give that one a rewatch because it's been a long time. I just remember always remembering being completely turned off by the look of the CGI werewolf. So, you know, stay away from those CGI werewolves. We already talked about that American Werewolf in Paris. Never, ever do that again. Brian Yuzna also reached out to a Japanese director, Shisuke Kaneko, who is responsible for some pretty cool Gamera films of the 90s. Also the 2001 Godzilla film, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, which is a pretty cool one, as well as Death Note 1 and 2, Death Note from 2006 and the sequel. He's also one of the highlights here, so he was able to get a director from the United States himself, from Europe, and Japan, so he had a pretty cool little idea here. And Necronomicon is not fucking around here with the horror. This thing goes into some pretty gnarly and grotesque storylines, as well as some really fucking amazing monsters and creatures that are brought to film. In the first segment, this guy inherits a hotel, all right? But there's also some creatures that are attached to this hotel, and the whole bottom basement of this thing, these catacombs exist, so you can see it through the floorboards that there's something going on down there. Fish people, that whole sort of aquatic horror thing going on, and it is done brilliantly. Some wildly, highly inspired practical effects, and also Maria Ford playing one of the monstrous fish people really adds to the charm of this film. Big Maria Ford fan, especially her appearance in Unnameable 2, which is surprisingly also a 90s Lovecraft film. Now, someday we'll have to get to that one. There's also another pretty cool tale. I believe it's the second one on here that features, you know, the iconic David Warner. There's a whole scenario with a woman renting a room below him, and there is some crazy shit going on upstairs as he's the scientist that's experimenting with this sort of cold technology that he uses to keep himself young. Things go in some pretty crazy directions there as well, and also some really wild practical effects. This movie is just filled with the goddamn practical effects up to the brim. I mean, you will not be disappointed if you're someone like me who appreciates that stuff, especially looking deeper into who is actually involved in the special effects. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that Tom Savini was involved, as well as John Carl Buechler. Screaming Mad George, who is just a wild effects wizard in his own right. Their talents are featured all over this thing. You get a mega dose of gory, gooey horror in this film that just does not let up. So I know I'm boasting a lot about the practical effects from Savini and Screaming Mad George, but something has to be said for the way that this film just looks in general. Really capture the spirit and vibe of Lovecraft, I think, in a perfect way. So this film has not only got practical monsters going for it, but a large part of it as well is the atmosphere and the cinematography and the locations, as well as the sets, really add to the whole experience of making Necronomicon so much fun. This is what you want to see from an HP Lovecraft inspired film, or one that's loosely retelling the stories. And to be quite honest, some pretty fucking action-packed segments. Some of them start off as a little bit of a slow burn, but believe me, by the end of each segment, things go fucking off the rails. So each one is a banger, even the wraparound. Very hard thing to find in horror anthologies, I've got to say. So the third segment Yuzna handles here, called Whispers. This female police officer, she chases this maniacal serial killer into a warehouse where things get really fucked up. She encounters a couple weird vagabonds that kind of lead her astray, and she ends up essentially in the pits of hell, encountering some truly disgusting creatures down there. Probably the goriest segment of this particular one is Whispers, and it does not disappoint. And that leads to the conclusion that wraps up the library, which is the wraparound segment. And that one delivers the goddamn goods as well with Jeffrey Combs. It almost gets into a pulpy kind of action finale involving Combs as Lovecraft almost being like some sort of supernatural adventurer. It would have been so cool to see Jeffrey Combs recast in this for either a sequel, or I could picture Jeffrey Combs also in this particular role with maybe Yuzna producing or directing a series that kind of takes him on an adventure. You know, in this one, he's tracking down the Necronomicon, but he could be hunting for all sorts of things all over the place. So this VHS, highly recommend tracking this one down. A total classic 90s horror anthology, could go head to head with any of the stuff from the 1980s. Someone has got to release this thing on Blu-ray. I will be so down to upgrade. I want to see all of that gory, gooey, wild monster effects given some clarity. Also, it does have a pretty solid and strong appearance by the Green Lamp. I don't know if you've checked out the Green Lamp video that we did where we interviewed Mr. Green and the whole Green Lamp conspiracy. You're going to want to check that one out right here. I give Necronomicon 4 damn stars, maybe even a little bit more. As far as horror anthologies go, this is one of the best. So check this shit out, and I will be back very soon next week to talk about my picks for Thanksgiving-themed recommended viewing that is totally off the beaten path of what anyone is checking out probably. Don't get me wrong, I am going to be watching Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, one of my favorite, but I'm also going to be pairing it up with some pretty cool shit. So the next video will be covering Thanksgiving-themed horror. So I will see you next time. Looking forward to hanging out with you again.